What does it do to a person to be the last one who saw someone alive, and then spend the rest of your life watching the world tell that story without you in it? Ginger Alden lived that for decades. She was engaged to Elvis Presley when he died. She was in the house at Graceland the morning it happened, and for a long time, she let everyone else do the talking. But eventually, she decided to tell it her own way. So what did she finally say? And why did it change how people see the last chapter of his life? Let's get into it. For most people, Ginger Alden is a name attached to one terrible morning, a footnote in the biggest death in music history. But she was a real woman with a whole life before any of that, and the story of how she ended up inside those Graceland gates is stranger and quieter than the tabloids ever made it sound. Ginger grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, one of 4 sisters in an ordinary family. Her father was an army officer, and the household ran on discipline and church on Sundays. There were no limousines in her childhood, no famous names at the dinner table, just a modest Memphis home and a tight-knit group of girls who looked out for each other. She was strikingly beautiful, dark-haired and photogenic, and by her early 20s, she'd started winning local pageants around the city. She wore the crowns and the sashes and carried the roses across small stages under bright lights. That was the world she lived in, ordinary and hopeful and completely disconnected from celebrity, when a phone call in November of 1976 pulled her toward a mansion she'd only ever driven past. Her older sister had actually met Elvis first, and it was through that connection that word came down the family line that the king of rock and roll wanted to meet Ginger in person. You can imagine the disbelief in that Memphis living room. A local pageant girl summoned to Graceland, the most famous private home in America. Its wrought iron gates already a landmark that tourists photographed from the street. Elvis wanted to meet her. By then, he was 41, the most famous entertainer alive, and already a very different man from the lean kid who'd shaken up American television 20 years earlier. He was tired. He was surrounded by an entourage that managed his every hour. But the moment Ginger walked into Graceland, something in him lit back up. She was 20 years old. He was smitten almost immediately. What happened next moved fast, even by his standards. Within days, Elvis was flying her out to see his shows aboard his private jet, the Lisa Marie, a converted airliner with his name painted across the tail. He swept her into a life of hotel suites, chartered flights, and stadiums full of screaming fans. She went from beauty pageants in Memphis to standing in the wings of sold-out arenas across the country, watching him command crowds of 20,000 people from a spotlit stage in a rhinestone jumpsuit. It was dizzying, the kind of life most people only see in grainy concert footage. But underneath the spectacle, she was getting to know the person almost nobody got to see. The one who stayed up all night talking in the quiet of a darkened hotel room. The one who was funny and restless and lonely, searching for something the fame had never managed to give him. She wasn't dating the icon on the poster. She was falling for the exhausted, generous man who lived behind it. Then, in January of 1977, he proposed. He gave her a ring with an 11.5-carat diamond, the kind of gesture only a man like Elvis could make. They were engaged. In her telling, he talked about the future, about marriage, about a version of his life that was calmer than the one he was living. For a young woman barely out of her teens, it should have been the beginning of everything. But the man she'd agreed to marry was already running out of time, and the signs were there for anyone close enough to see them. Because behind the Graceland gates, Elvis was struggling. The touring schedule was brutal, a relentless grind of arenas and airports that would have flattened a much younger man. He'd play a city, board the jet, fly to the next one, and do it all again the following night, his body worn down by years of that punishing rhythm. The performances still dazzled the crowds, but the man walking off stage was fraying. Those closest to him watched his health slip through 1977, the exhaustion deepening, the good days getting rarer, the recovery time between shows stretching longer. Ginger was there for the last stretch of it, close enough to see the private toll the legend was paying just to keep being the legend in public. She saw the difference between the figure on stage and the man in the quiet house afterward, and that gave her a vantage point almost no one else on Earth had, which is exactly why what she eventually chose to say would carry so much weight. But we'll come back to that. In August of 1977, Elvis was preparing for yet another tour, with his bags packed and the concert dates already locked into the calendar. He was supposed to fly out of Memphis late on the night of the 15th, off to open another run of shows in another city. Instead, he stayed up into the early hours at Graceland, restless, the way he so often was. He'd been out to a dentist appointment, he'd played racquetball on the property, and he'd rattled around the big quiet house the way a man does when sleep won't come. Ginger was there with him inside those gates, and that ordinary, exhausting night, indistinguishable from 100 others, would turn into the morning that ended an era. On August 16, 1977, Elvis went upstairs to the bathroom while Ginger rested. Hours passed. When she went to check on him, she found him collapsed on the floor. She called for help immediately, and the house erupted into panic. Aides rushing up the stairs, an ambulance racing toward the Graceland gates. He was taken to Baptist Memorial Hospital, but it was already too late. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead that afternoon, at 42 years old. The world stopped. Within hours, crowds gathered outside Graceland by the thousands, weeping in the brutal Memphis August heat, pressing against the wrought iron gates with candles and photographs and handmade signs, refusing to leave. The news broke on every television and radio station in the country, interrupting programming coast to coast. Flags were mentioned in tributes, records flew off shelves, and an entire generation felt the floor drop out from under them at the same moment. And in the middle of all of that noise and grief stood a 20-year-old woman who had just lost the man she was going to marry, the man whose ring she still wore, and who had been the one to find him. While the whole world mourned a superstar, she was mourning a person. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, take a second to subscribe, because this channel covers the untold chapters behind the world's most famous names every single week. But here's where Ginger's story takes the turn almost nobody expected. In the chaos that followed, she didn't step into the spotlight. She didn't sell her story to the highest bidder or spin herself into the grieving heroine of a national tragedy. She went quiet, and she stayed quiet for a very long time, while everyone else built the myth of Elvis's final days without her. For decades, the books poured out. Biographers, former aides, and people who'd barely known him all published their versions of what those last months and hours were like. Some were careful, many weren't. Ginger's name appeared in most of them, usually as a character in someone else's account, rarely as a voice of her own. She watched the story of the most intimate stretch of her life get told and retold and distorted by people who hadn't been in the room. And still, she said almost nothing. Then, in 2014, after nearly 40 years of letting others speak for her, Ginger Alden finally told it herself. She wrote a memoir, and in it, she did the one thing all those other accounts couldn't. She described those final months from the inside as the person who'd actually lived them beside him. So what did she reveal? Not a scandal. Not a bombshell built to sell copies or settle scores. Something quieter and, in a way, heavier than any tabloid headline. Across hundreds of pages, she painted a portrait of a man who was gentle and generous and deeply human, a world away from the bloated punchline the culture had slowly, cruelly turned him into in the years after his death. She described the tenderness of the private Elvis, his humor, his loneliness, the plans he still had, and she wrote honestly about the decline she'd watched up close, the exhaustion of a man being consumed by his own fame, without ever reducing him to it. Her account gave the last chapter of his life something the tabloid versions never had: dignity and a witness who loved him. That's what made her silence, and then her decision to break it, matter so much. She wasn't cashing in. She'd waited until she could tell it on her own terms, as the woman who'd been there, and she used that account to push back gently against decades of caricature. In a story crowded with people claiming to know the real Elvis, she was one of the very few who actually did. In his final months, at the closest possible range. That's the difference between a witness and a headline, and for nearly 40 years, she'd chosen to be neither until the moment was right. Ginger Alden went on to live a private life, largely out of the public eye, carrying a memory most people can barely imagine. She was the last love of Elvis Presley's life, the last person to see him alive, and for a long time, the quietest voice in his story. When she finally spoke, she didn't tear anything down. She added the one perspective the legend had always been missing. If this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting on your screen right now about the final days of another icon the world thought it knew. Go see how that one ends.